Hey, Wrecker, what's going on?
Some smart person told you not to take a job that would lead you into a situation that you're actually in. That smart person is me, and the dumb person that took the job is you.
Yeah, well, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's filled up my calendar. So I do things like show up late for podcast calls. But part of my deal is I'm going to continue. I'm really trying my best to continue doing research, and I wanted to keep
Mm.
doing. And the thing that I love, Wrecker, that I feel
Institutional
like
theory?
well,
No.
that I love a lot of things about research.
Pragmatism? No.
Yeah. But this computationally intensive theory construction stuff, right? I started off as kind of doing inductive, exploratory, qualitative work. And then I realized, wait, there are all these technologies where you could explore. If you think about it, what's a human? We're computers, aren't we? And we're doing things like pattern recognition, pattern matching, right? When we do qualitative work. Well, if you get a computer, it's essentially being an extension of your humanness in constructing theory from empirical data, right? So I'll tell you what, and ever since I've been doing this, there are a number of us who are kind of like the gang that are trying to. And one of the papers that inspired me when we wrote our initial editorial back in 2019 was Shaila Miranda's 2015 paper on
Yes.
jamming with social media, right? Because that's what she did. It wasn't even a genre yet, but yet she kind of did an exploratory using some computational techniques and came up with some theory in the back. So she was really I guess, a trailblazer in this method that then we leverage. So anyway, Shaila, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. I've enjoyed your podcast for quite a while now.
Wow. That is such a testament. That's
No,
awesome.
Wrecker, Shaila actually listens. She sometimes sends little notes, like we're collaborating on a couple of things, and she'll send little notes about some reference to what we said in the podcast. So how's this? It's not just people who don't know anything. Even Shaila listens
Like
to us.
yeah, exactly. Like Shaila, I mean, like we do get nice feedback really from people that listen to us, and you may know that we have a lot of young emerging scholars listening to us, and which is wonderful, and of course it makes us feel good as well, of course. But to be honest, like hearing that someone like you listens to this, or recently we had Ola commenting like 10 minutes after the episode was out, they already listened to it. It was like, wow, that makes me feel very special. I'm not gonna
Yeah.
lie about it. It makes me feel
Well,
good.
it is very energizing, and I get to hear about stuff I should have read and I've missed, and introductions to people. So it's just really wonderful.
So Shaila, we're doing this stuff, and right, you and I and our gang, right? We have maybe Hani Safadi and Stefan Seidel and Aaron Lindbergh, and there are a few others that are in this space, and we're trying to create I don't know. Well, I've given my view of it. What do you think we're trying to do here with our computationally intensive? Like, how do you see this?
So first, I want to do a call out to Natalia
Yeah.
because, but for her work on quantitative grounded theory, I think I would have had a much harder time with that 2015 Visions of Social Media paper.
Was she your
Um,
editor or no? Who was your editor on that?
no, but remember that they had published a couple of articles on quantitative grounded theory.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I think that gave what I wanted to do a lot more legitimacy. And I was able to say, okay, this idea of building on what has gone before. So if that had not existed, I don't know that we could have pulled off that particular piece.
Give us a little bit of the backstory. When you say like, look, this prior work on quantitative grounded theory gave you legitimacy, which I do think is a real thing. It's kind of similar. The paper that comes to my mind always is Al Hafner's Design Science 2004. That was a legitimacy creating paper. It didn't invent the genre or whatever, but it gave it legitimacy, right? So I think that's important. But do you recall an instance in the, I don't know, in the review process, I guess, where people challenged you that this is not okay or not good enough or whatever, and then that you could say like, no, this is completely fine, this is established? Was that an issue?
So even before you get into the review process, there's the conversations you have with yourself. Am I going to be able to make this work? I'm not the most confident person, so to have something like that to hang my hat on. And then the second step is communicating with your co-authors. And these are PhD students, and you don't want to waste their time because it is really imperative for them to have, for the effort that they put in to be successful. So even before we get in the review process, I thought it was imperative for us to kind of understand how we could make this work.
Yeah.
And that that series of articles that Natalia wrote and co-authored with Isabel Walsh, and I think one of them even had Glaser on it. I think that really gave us a foundation to build on. And then we had the initial 2012 ISIS submission, which got some traction and also gave us a little bit of confidence. And then you guys had the ISR paper, and I think that really brought together this genre wonderfully well and gave us way more confidence for the follow-on piece that we did.
And the follow-on piece that you refer to, that's your discursive formation, the blockchain paper?
Yes, the blockchain.
Yeah, that is an amazing piece of work. It has so much in it.
Yeah. Well, and if you look at what she did, it's really like we wrote an editorial, Shaila and I, along with Hani and Stefan, where we at one point used the, I guess, analogy of a detective, where you're getting in detective work, you have a hunch, then you follow up that hunch. And then, so I was associate editor for Shaila's paper, the one you're talking about, the 2022. And I feel like she did a bunch of that detective work ahead of time and then continued to do it throughout the review process, right? They kept uncovering things, reframing it, uncovering. It's like you overturn a stone, compare it to the literature, overturn another stone, compare it to the literature, throw out the previous literature you looked at, right? It was like this incredibly grueling process, actually, I imagine, from an author standpoint, right?
I actually find that process fun. But since you brought that up, I have two questions for you. So there were a couple of moments when that process seemed less appealing to you and Andrew. And I also have to give a shout out to Andrew because he was the senior editor on both the 2015 paper and this one. And I think I owe a lot to his sort of open-mindedness about this emerging genre. But the first moment was, I think even before the paper was into the review process, we were doing a response to you guys' initial feedback. And while we were reacting to that, one of my students had also provided some feedback, and I responded to him and blew up this analysis. And Andrew said, "Oh, no, that's way more than I wanted you to do. Please cut that out." So that was one moment. And the second moment was, I want to say...
Well, real quick, Shaila, I do remember that because it's like you needed to stop. You were off the rails. We're in like round 3. We're trying to get you to you have these cool findings. Now let's write it up. And you're like, so I did this additional analysis and now I did this additional analysis, right? You kept wanting to do more analyses. We actually stopped you. It was a weird, if I recall correctly, it was a weird review process where usually the authors want to stop and publish what they have. And the editorial team is pushing them for more analysis. This was the opposite. We wanted you to stop doing analysis. Stop, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah. Yeah. So the second, go ahead.
Sorry, I want to do an interjection. It's a bit of a detour. But since you bring this up, right? So you seem to be an author that does a lot of things in the revision process and keeps doing more and more and more. And you're both also editors. We're all editors. And, sometimes we ask authors to do more, right? Do more robustness, to get more data, etc. I want to talk about this a little bit because I'm a person that likes to do both things, right? So as an author, I would be very happy to rewrite a paper and take it in a different direction. And as an editor, I demand that of people as well. And I sometimes sit there and wonder whether others feel the same way. And my hypothesis is they don't, neither as an editor or as an author. So I just wanted to ask you, I guess, as editors, like, do you experience a lot of pushbacks from authors in really changing a paper into a different direction? And why is it that some people apparently are happy to do that and other people are really not happy to do that, I guess is my question. Sorry, it's a detour, I know.
Well, Shaila, go ahead and maybe you can answer it. I guess
I think people that want to publish in premier journals really tend to be curious about their own data, tend to want to do the very best. I'm working on a revision with, the amazing Malmi Amadora, really rising star. And Erin Lindbergh gave her advice, you want to pull out all the stops on this. You don't just want to dot your I's and cross the T's responding to the reviewers. You want to tell them you've gone all out. And I just really love that perspective. So from a reviewer and editor perspective, yes, it would be wonderful to see that authors have had that. I want this paper this is my paper. I want it to be the best it can be, right? So that's the perspective I would want to see. But I think as a co-author, I can be a little tedious that I maybe want to do more than is necessary. And finding that balance between, okay, now is the time to stop, and maybe I can feed this curiosity with a follow-on paper. That is a line I have to try and work out.
So let's talk about those stopping rules, but real quick to answer your point there, I agree with Shaila, and I don't, as an author, like to do additional analysis because I think I have an argument. And they should publish my argument, right? Now, if they see holes in my argument, I will, of course, and they always do. The first round, second round, editors always find things that I'm like, wow, all right, yeah, I guess I missed that. And they tell me to get rid of something that I liked, and it actually makes the paper better. And there's a couple things like that. So first, second round, I don't complain much because it's usually pretty fair. Usually after that, anything they tell me to do, I'm kind of upset because I'm like, listen, you had your first 2 rounds to give me feedback. Now we should just be dotting I's and crossing T's. We should not be going and doing more analysis. Right? You should have had this figured out, editorial team, long before now, right? So I get kind of annoyed as we go on when they ask me to do things because it's like, come on, we're here. It's like we've said many times, every study is one brick in the edifice of our knowledge. No study is perfect. No study is unassailable. It's okay. Is it solid? Let's put it in and go to the next study, right? Shaila, I've said this a number of times to record that I think 80% of our papers should be research notes and only 20% should be full papers, because I think then we'd have this mentality of, okay, let's get cool research out and have a faster pace instead of this gold plate stuff for 6 years, right? So it's no longer relevant to anything. But anyway, that was that. But I want to go back to Shaila. She had 2 points you were making. The first, right, which I've now already forgotten, but it was about continuing to do analysis throughout your review
when do you
process.
stop, right?
Yeah. So we should go back to stopping, but before we do that, I wanted to hear what your next thing is that you wanted to.
The other one was, I think in the second revision, I had this major misstep, and I pulled together this other analysis that in retrospect didn't work. And I think there was a moment when the majority of the review team wanted to reject. And as an editor, in a similar position, this is a really interesting paper, but somehow the author team has misstepped here. And I want to go back. I really believe in how did you guys negotiate that?
Oh, we didn't negotiate. It's not the review team's job to accept papers. Their job is to poke holes in papers. The editors are the ones who decide they like a paper and will publish it, or they don't. So we were helping you publish your paper. And if you made a misstep, then we pointed out you made a misstep. And this is my problem with our field and with a lot of fields is weak senior editors. And weak senior editors become risk averse. And if weak senior editors are risk averse, they will only accept papers that meet all the criteria of the reviewers. And then we get a lot of mediocre, rigorous papers. That's not what we want. We want mediocre, rigorous papers, sure. But we also want creative, clever, different, risk-taking papers. The only way you could do that is with confident editors that are like, I want to publish this. And they have to ignore a reviewer. You don't ignore reviewers. You read what the reviewers say, and you say, look, this is a legitimate criticism. This isn't. You don't have to deal with this one. You have to deal with that one. That's a strong editor who has that judgment. Anybody who doesn't have that judgment and just says you have to please the reviewers, in my mind, is a weak editor. And as far as I'm concerned, we have too many of those weak editors who will just tally up the votes, say you have to please the reviewers, and they go 6 rounds of review. And it's like, This is ridiculous.
So You know that I agree with you, and I think Shaila would probably agree with you too. But we also got to be very honest that this view is not necessarily reciprocally felt by everybody else. There's also author teams who don't like too strong editors. There's also author teams that actually like, look, I've done everything that Reviewer 123 asked me to do, and who are you to bring me another 4 pages? It's, taking me a different direction because you feel like you have to be a strong editor, right? It's a little that also happens, and has happened to me, to you, to everyone, I guess.
Right, and there's also the pressure to either decide on round 2 or round 3. That beyond that, you're taking this through too many revisions, and that's what I struggle with.
Well, what we did with you, Shaila, and what I generally do, I don't know how many rounds we used reviewers with you. We might have gone one more round because of that weird revision one. But usually what I do is so tell me what you think of this. You're both senior editors. I know I've told this to Record before, but 2 rounds of reviewers. After that, the AE and the SE can go another 3 rounds if they want, or however many rounds. But at that point, they should have decided either I'm going to bring this paper in for a landing or I'm going to reject it. You do not need reviewers for more than 2 rounds. What do you think of that rule? Rule of thumb, knowing that it's not universal. There are exceptions, of course, but in general, reviewers 2 rounds.
So I actually like that idea of not consuming reviewer time unnecessarily, and also sort of streamlining the review process, that you're not zigzagging the authors through multiple, but this maybe, and that the exception I would say is sometimes I don't have confidence in my ability to navigate a methodological issue. And maybe it's not in the A's repertoire either. And that's when I need someone on the review team.
Yeah, sure. Of course. Yeah. And that's the exception, right? If they bought off on the methodologies, then I have a paper right now I'm handling where the reviewers in the last round bought off of the methodology. They resubmitted, and I just sent a note, and it was just resubmitted. So I sent a note to the AE. I'm like, all right, let me know if you think we need reviewers, right? But in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, we don't need reviewers anymore. He and I should be able to handle this and bring it in for a landing in a round or 2, So I really think we should. And when you say you don't have the confidence, you have the confidence in paper construction. It's just a particular method, right? And I think that if you have a particular methodological issue you're not comfortable with, then yes, of course, you seek assistance. I've actually we did this, I think, Record in our special issue. Alok Gupta and those guys, their paper. Remember they added the formalisms.
They added
in
formalism
the 3rd round.
Yeah. And we had nobody. Exactly.
Yeah.
We asked a math guy to look at that. And that is perfectly fine. I mean, because wouldn't feel equipped. To me, it looked good.
Yeah. It's like a lot of numbers and equations. Very good.
So stopping rules. I want to talk about this because you said you bring in more analysis until you need to figure out a place to stop before you overdo it. What I do sometimes, or very often, in fact, is in the revision process, I bring in more data. Even if the reviewers don't ask for it, I just like doing that because it gives me more data, etc. And also, by the way, even if reviewers don't ask for it, it's always a responsive strategy, right? It's always a good thing to do. So I like doing this in principle, but of course, at some stage, we need to figure out, okay, that's enough. And this is not another analysis. This is going to be a new story, etc. By what heuristic do you use to make these decisions? When's enough enough? I'll give you a concrete example. Like my students still ask me, with the ones that do qualitative work, is how many interviews do I need? Well, do 30. Let's start with 30, see where we end up. What do you say to that?
Exactly.
Yeah. So when do you stop? When is enough data enough? When have you done enough analysis? I actually have an easier time navigating that on my own projects, I think, than sometimes as an SE. So on the one hand, it does seem responsive to bring in additional data and run more analyses. From an SE or reviewer perspective, it seems like, okay, these people are going beyond what has been required of them. They are committed to the paper. And I can see that as a wonderful signal. But it can also overwhelm. So I was thinking, and I putting myself in you and Andrew's position as you were navigating my paper, Nick. from that perspective, you'd align yourself with one way of looking at the data, looking at the story, and now we zag. For example, when I brought in the logics perspective and how logics and frames went together, which is, yes, we won't talk about it. But that does tend to sidetrack the review process, right? I mean, now the reviewers are reassessing the paper. We have this new way of looking at the data. So you're actually stepping them back to square one. And I think that can be dangerous.
That is dangerous.
So I actually find myself doing very much what you guys did with me, which is less is more. Let's maybe scale back what you're presenting in terms of both data and methods, and try and focus. And in focusing, you can maybe tell a more interesting story, or even tell your story better with more nuance and depth than if you're scoping too broadly.
And I think that's the key, right?
Yeah.
Record, this is, if I could give the number one advice for exploratory work, and you see a lot of it. You see some of it published, which is in a sense, the problem, where when these things make it through and they're published, and there are a lot of findings. If you find that the model you're creating has a lot of things that are antecedents, and then a lot of consequences and a lot of circular arrows about how everything's affecting everything, chances are you are not saying that much original stuff. There's probably only 2 of those lines in that big complex model that is original.
That I actually knew,
that are new. And the problem is some of these get published, so people think, okay, that's what I need to do with exploratory work, is I need to make the Mac daddy of all process. And this is the final word on this process and this activity, right? And it's like, well, no, you need to use literature, what other people have found, to take those lines off your findings, right? You almost want to, and we've talked about this, any exploratory work, the first couple rounds of analysis, whether it's qualitative or computationally intensive, the first couple things I find, I need to move to the front end because of the paper, because the literature has already found them. So I don't need to do my study to construct that argument. So the same way that we use literature, I think, so this is my non-cynical way of saying, what's the stopping rule for an exploratory work? Well, the moment I have evidence for extending or questioning an assumption in the prevailing body of knowledge, right? If there's theory and the theory says X, like in Shaila's paper, the 2022 paper, right? She constructed how discourse, there's this assumption about it. She showed, well, no, it actually is more complicated than that. Here's a way that it's more complicated. Boom, full stop. If you have evidence for that argument, questioning an assumption that's in the literature, you have one, I'd much rather 1 or 2 small, incremental, thoroughly developed than a big complex, framework and structure, right? So I think that's the non-cynical stopping rule. The cynical stopping rule is, well, for qualitative work, it used to be 30 interviews, now it's 50 interviews. And for computationally intensive, you want thousands and thousands of data points, not hundreds of data points, right? So it's like, and if you have hundreds of thousands, then you're looking really good, right? Now those are the cynical routes, but there is an element of heft that you need in your analysis to show, so to just look good.
It's interesting talking about the number of interviews, because recently the number I heard was 100.
And is that the new number?
We have this paper, and at the start of the project, I came onto the project a little bit late, and they had 17 interviews. And I said, there's no way we're going to get a public publication out of this with 17 interviews. But I think that ended up being a strength of the paper, because we converted those 17 interviews to 15 cases, pulled on additional archival data around those cases, and had a way richer story than we could possibly have had with more interviews.
I think the takeaway there is not every interview is equal. There are great interviews, and they're deep interviews, and they're rich interviews, and there are very shallow ones. I can do 100 very shallow interviews and not learn anything. And I can do 1 really key interview, and that tells us. The second key rule there is a case study is not an interview. A case study is you studying a case. And if it's a firm, you try to learn everything about the firm, or, and that means you talk to people, sure. We tend to go there. as often as we can and be there. And then there's document, and there's, I don't know, these days there are podcasts about these things. There's clips and videos, and, there's so much document. So if you do a case study, you try to get as much information on the case, which sure interviews, right? But there's more than that. And then maybe 10 interviews, 10 great interviews, rich interviews are very, very much enough. And I don't need to bolster them with 40 shallow, meaningless interviews.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, so that's all. So I would look at Carl Weick, right? He reads a book and writes a paper from it, right? So as far as I'm concerned, theory construction, you can do without an interview. You can do it with one interview or 0 interviews. You could read a book like Carl Weick and generate theory. You could just have logic. You could read the literature, put 2 literatures together, have some logic, generate theory, right? We're talking about generating theory here now, aren't we? So you could do it from 1 interview. You could do it from 50 or 100 interviews. You could do it from big data. You could do it. The trick is you're trying to, if you're not hypothesis testing, if you're hypothesis testing, I think the paradigm switches a little, where you have to argue for a certain representativeness and you have to have certain boundary conditions, right? So hypothesis testing is different. This is exploratory, right? Generating arguments. And I think generating arguments with data is better than generating them without data sometimes, right? If it's a convincing trail of evidence. So the trick is you have to be convincing, right? And we actually had this. So we have a paper that's out now in MISQ. It's on entrainment and open source software. And Aaron Lindbergh's the lead author. We have a great author team. And it's computationally intensive theory construction, right? It's exploratory. And we were studying open source, and I think the first time we just looked at 4 open source projects, and then we, generated our conceptualization. And the first time the reviewers came back, and I don't remember exactly what they said, but they're like, "Why only 4? Why don't you do all the open source projects?" Right? And we're like, "Oh man, we can't do all." And really, there's no reason to not do all. So Dekwebe Maruping was the senior editor. So we got together with him and we're like, "Dude, is it okay if we don't do all? What if we sample based on difference? We got those 4 based on similarity, right? Now let's sample based on difference. And if we find 3 much different projects that aren't the huge ones and aren't the small ones, this is the midsize, and we find the same pattern, is that enough for generating our theory, and let future research, test it and elaborate it and check out all?" And he goes, "Yeah, that makes sense." So in the review process, we replied to the reviewers saying, "Look, we sampled 3 based on difference. We ran it by the senior editor. The senior editor thought that was a good idea." So we now hid behind the senior editor in our reviewer response, and then it worked. And then everybody was happy with the number of projects we sampled for that case, right? So that's one of those. It's like almost you're negotiating the stopping rule of when to collect data.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
But it helps to have a good editor on that.
Yeah, well,
somebody is willing to take the sense.
Shaila, what do you think of that? Nick and I think late last year, we came across this paper that was this interpretive case study together with analytical modeling by Supra and others. Came out in ISR. We loved it very much because it's such an innovative, mixed method study. But they also had the best stopping rule of all time. They had the no apparent absurdity stopping rule to replace theoretical saturation or whatever else we usually need, right? So I love that so much. The idea, like, so we get more data until we find no more absurdities. I like that too.
Yeah, that is wonderful. And I think you need really strong logic skills. And if you think of and Supra is wonderful in that, but if you think of who he was trained by, Alan Lee was like the guru on logical thinking.
So wait, Supra was Alan Lee's student?
Yeah.
Supra was yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Interesting. All right, I can see that lineage now.
So I want to shift gears a little bit, because you two were behind the editorial on computation intensive theory construction, and we actually had an episode on that one that came out. When was that? 2 years ago, maybe. And I wanted to ask you guys 2 things. So one of the things when it was coming out, it was a legitimacy paper. It was a methodological paper in a sense that you give guidelines for people how to, author and evaluate such papers. But it was also a legitimacy paper. And I think the legitimacy giving aspect of that paper was that you said, look, patterns can be a theoretical contributions. Basically, right? You say, like, look, we can be detective, we can find theoretically interesting, relevant patterns. And if they meet certain criteria, that could be a theoretical contribution worth publishing. Now, I said at the time, I said, like, look, that can be dangerous, right? That can be seen as opening the floodgates for people now claiming that all sorts of more or less regular patterns are a theoretical contribution. So that could be a worry, A. And B, legitimacy giving is only relevant if it gives legitimacy, and then we see more and more of this genre. So these two questions that I wanted to ask you now, 2 years later, did it open the floodgates in any sense? Did you come across it? And second, do you need to see more papers doing what you propose? Either of these two things, or is it too early to tell?
I am not seeing a lot of papers that are, I would say, super ambitious. So I would actually view that as an ambitious type of knowledge claim, that I've identified a pattern, and I think this pattern alone is interesting. And you know, if you think about the exemplar that we used at Adamic and Glantz, the reason that was appealing was because they were disclaiming a way that we were looking at social media. So we were thinking social media is going to be this wonderful, emancipatory, open information space where everyone is going to have access to different perspectives. And of course, they're going to process and absorb these perspectives. But look at, you know, in fact, we're as polarized as we were if we were watching CNN and Fox.
Yeah.
Right?
If not more, yeah.
Yeah. So that was kind of an eye-opening revelation. And that was why that was so successful. So I'm sure if we saw something that was as eye-opening, even lacking explanation for how and why that was occurring, we would view it as a pattern on its way to a theoretical contribution that merited publication.
Yeah, I think that I haven't seen too many people trying to publish patterns yet. As a matter of fact, that was Shaila, I don't know if you, but one of the big things that in our editorial that I wanted to make sure was this idea that patterns could be, because people who play with machine learning, play with some of these computations, maybe they're not that into theory, but they're finding some cool pattern. So we wanted to give them an avenue. You know, you can't force them to do it this particular way, right? Didn't we talk about the other day? You can have a duck can walk, but really they're much better flying and swimming. So why would we force a duck to walk? Let's just let them fly and swim, you know? So those folks who are really into the computational methods and that, identify your cool pattern and then tell us why it's important. And there's still the rhetorical end. You still have to argue for why it's important, but we were trying to, and I haven't seen that, but you know what I have seen come from that editorial? Shaila, we have an image where we talk about the practice lexicon, the method lexicon, and the theoretical lexicon. I've seen that now a couple of times where the authors actually characterize what words they used in practice, what words they have in their method, what words they have in the theory, and they're linking that. So I think that ends up being the thing that people are taking away, where they're actually taking that image of ours, putting it in their paper, but putting their, you know, their theory in the middle box and then their method in the middle box and then some of the words they, right? So I think that's the thing that people are going to pick up. Yeah.
Well, as long as they pick up something.
Well, you guys had the synchronic and diachronic analysis in your 2019 paper, and that was sort of the way we structured the blockchain paper after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much concepts and associations, right? So that's what we're talking about is this, for those who aren't familiar with this genre. There are basically two things you want to do to create theory using any number of computational methods. You can use one computational methods, you can use multiple in conjunction, you can mix computation, traditional like regression or variance-based quantitative and qualitative. You know, mix whatever you want. What are you doing? You're trying to create concepts and then associations among those concepts. Create those concepts, cross-sectional, synchronic, right? Associations usually involve some sort of temporal element. So synchronic, diachronic. Then it's like, okay, well, when you're doing this, you're using different methods. Those different methods have their lexicon, their way of talking. You know, social network analysis might have nodes, topic modeling might have topics, whatever. Then there's the theory. The theory has its concepts and associations that it already has, you know, whatever, usefulness leads to ease of whatever. Then there's the practice. There's the people out in the world and what words they use. And we have to reconcile the words they use in the world with the words of our method. So this reconciling all these moving parts is really one of the challenges when you start using different methods too. And I think you did this beautifully, Shaila, in your 2022 paper, right? But because it was such a challenging thing. It was so theoretically dense. There was so practical. There was the practice vocabulary, and then there was the
methodological, because you use so many of them. Yeah, that would have been difficult. Another good example that comes to my mind is the paper by Brian Pentland and Emma Vaast. Right? Because they also, I think in an appendix, don't they have this translation of the 3 lexica in an appendix? Like, we call this routine, these people call it process, and in the network it's called an edge or something, yeah? So they do the translation between the
it was footnotes. They did that in like one footnote, I think, if I recall correctly. But yeah, they did the translation explicitly in that paper.
So let's talk a little bit about you set up, and I guess the intent is to open up and legitimize this genre, computation intensive, exploration for theory construction. You give a pathway to identify, detect patterns, give some guidelines, but also make it legitimate, right? So that's like creating a new genre. And what I do in my head, and tell me if you agree with this, I always liken it to what the design science community did 20 years ago. So you needed to have some people doing it. You needed to have this one big legitimacy creating paper. And then what they managed, of course, is now 20 years later, this is completely an established genre. It's not super mainstream. It's not as many design science people as there are, survey people, behavioral people, whatever, but certainly established, etc. So, and they did a couple of things on the way. I think the like in my head, what are the next steps? Well, first of all, we need a couple of really good papers in that genre, don't we? Yeah. And second, of course, there's still methodological details to iron out. I mean, I'm drawing this from the experience from the design science people. They had a bunch within this community, had a bunch of tricky questions like, how much theory do we need? How do we do this? What are different evaluation methods? What are this? What are this? What are this? So it basically became a flurry of exemplar papers together with, I guess, methodological advances, so like further editorial guidance for that genre. Do you see the same path playing out? Like, is it going to be similar for you guys or for that genre that you guys are pushing? Or are you trying a different way?
For me, the more proximate analogy is the qualitative turn, maybe pushing back 30, 35 years. My next door neighbor is Mary Lassity, and she was saying that she came out doing qualitative research when everyone else was doing experiments. And that was a challenging time. And that's exactly what we're facing right now. I love this area of research because this particular genre, because it is so creative, right? I mean, you can just kind of let your creative imperative roll with this. But when I'm working with junior colleagues, PhD students, it is also, I think, significantly more an uphill genre than some others. So on the one hand, you have to develop this, we talked about methodological pluralism in the editorial. And they are developing methodological skills that go beyond the traditional stat sequence in a PhD program. We talked about discursive flexibility. You cannot, so a traditional dissertation would start with, okay, I've entertained maybe 1 or 2 theoretical lenses. I've acquainted myself with this particular literature stream, but you have to be able and willing to switch out those lenses as you go through the process. And then you tack on that the liability of newness, right? So this is where I'm sort of committed to try and say, okay, how do we help them navigate the authorship process? How do we help them navigate the review process? And one of the issues that I saw with qualitative methods was the fragmentation that Supra did this really wonderful job of pulling together in his JIS papers, that people coming at it from a grounded theory perspective or evaluating people, the work of people from an interpretive perspective. And there was this mishmash of criteria and the fallout of that, I think, was very discouraging to qualitative researchers. So on the one hand, you're defending your emergent genre against the experimentalists who are saying, but that doesn't make sense. This is not research, right? And then within your genre, you're defending against people who are not within that method. And I think this is where, Ryan Pentland's concern and Natalia's concern about fragmentation of this particular genre becomes really important. So what are the challenges? So regardless of whether you are doing, text analysis or network analysis or process mining, what are the generic guardrails that we can have? What are the generic issues that we face? And how do we navigate that? The last thing I wanted to be was a methods person, because I remember Aaron saying at one of the AOM PDWs, for every computationally intensive theory piece that you write, you should have a corresponding methods piece. And I love that he does that. It is so hard to do because to have to go back, rather than look at a new data set, which is way more interesting and entertaining. But it is, I think, really important that we start to develop those that kind of structure for the young scholars coming through trying to do this, right? So for stopping rules, I think the two big issues I'm starting to see through the review process. The first is this issue of generalizability, right?
Yeah.
And Nick has made this case before that maybe every study is a case, regardless of whether it was a qualitative piece or an econometric modeling piece. And I really think that I love that perspective. And if we could get, widespread buy-in to that, I think it would be helpful from a multitude of perspectives. As we get into replication, the failure to replicate becomes an opportunity for theoretical extension and not a criticism of the vilification of the author. And that goes back to also one of the recurrent themes of humility. So this idea of, what we do is contextualize. If you read Lincoln and Huber's 1985, this idea of generalizability as context-free statements of enduring value, that's a fool's errand. And then in 2003, Alan Lee and Richard Baskerville had this really elegant logical critique of generalizability. And they start with Hume's truism that this traditional understanding of generalization it's an inductive process, and you're moving from the particular cases to the general.
So real quick, I do want to stop you here, because even if you listen to your words, you were talking about generalizability and then you switched over to generalization. And that's one of my problems with Lee and Baskerville is those are two different things, right? Generalizability is a characteristic of the assertion.
Person generalizing.
No. It's when I say this is a generalizable finding or whatever my assertion is, that I'm making a generalizable statement, that you can take this statement and you can move it to other contexts from which the statement was, right? So that's generalizability. It's a property of the statement. Generalization is something a human does, right? So we generalize. I think generalization is totally acceptable. We generalize all the time. I generalize based on my handful of interactions with a certain, my son's friends, what kind of group they're there, or what they might do at night, or based on what I know of other people. We as humans can't help but generalize. We make generalizations all the time, but that doesn't mean that is generalizable in a universal sense, right? Or even to a population or something, right? Over time. And that's why I actually have a problem with that Lee and Baskerville paper, where I think they're a little sloppy like that, where they'll mix up generalization and generalizability. I think they mix it. And I was associate editor for the Tsang and Williams paper that came in 2013, somewhere around there. And I thought, now they came as a very hostile, arguing with Lee and Baskerville paper. And over the review process, it was Detmar Straub and I, and we helped, and I think there was another reviewer with that. We helped them turn it into more of a, okay, so construct something. And I actually like the back of their paper because they're the ones who say, look, nothing is universally generalizable, but here are the different paths of, and they called it like particularism and what. So I actually like their formulation a little bit, but I think it's more precise. I don't know. So, and I think it's because of that. And actually, we're writing together right now, Shaila. And I noticed you put a note in there where it kind of also mixed that generalizability and generalization. So I was going to be like, okay, I get the idea, but so I'm going to edit that portion.
Well, I think your point is well taken. Generalization is a very human process that in order to make our lives at all actionable, we make generalizations, right? Yeah. But to make a claim that that a particular statement is likely to be universally truthful in the social realm, I think is begging for problems, right?
We generalize, and we should have, and this is Hume, by the way. If you go back to Hume's problem, he points out the problem of induction. He says, look, so therefore, we have no analytical support for our any assertions that we make, essentially, from an inductive standpoint.
Yeah, we are extrapolating at that point.
And then he said, but then I leave my study, or he has a famous quote, and he said, I leave my study and I have to, and of course I have induction from it, right? Because I have to act in the world. So I think Hume sets up a very humble way of generalizing. It's like, of course we have to generalize. Just know that all your generalizations are probably wrong. They're the best you know at the moment, and you need to do that in order to act. But, pay attention. It might not hold.
And that is a wonderful attitude towards this issue of generalizability and generalization. The problem I have is when reviewers challenge a particular setting by saying, but how do I know this will apply elsewhere? Or why did you choose that particular setting? To go back to the example that you gave, your open source projects, right? De Quobe was very reasonable and said, okay, that makes sense. But what if you'd had an editor that said, no, you really do need to go through the totality of the projects that you have available? Because that will allow us to say,
everything,
to articulate a stronger statement about these projects.
See, I think this notion of, I think that is generalizability isn't even the issue, or it shouldn't be. Let's put it this way, it shouldn't even be the issue. If I go and do computationally intensive exploratory pattern recognition, I find a theoretically interesting pattern. Is that generalizable? No, probably not. But why does it have to be? Like, isn't the more interesting question a criterion, how fertile and generative is that? And with that, I mean, with that insight, let's say entrainment, yeah, that's your thing, right? Entrainment. I don't actually know what that means. I haven't read the paper, but the question to me would be like, okay, can I now take this and readily, or more readily than otherwise, construct new interesting hypotheses? Can I go and be generative in the sense that it generates other new insights? That is not a question of generalizability. I don't care whether it generalizes beyond open source or even beyond the 6 projects, the whatever however you sampled them. I don't care about that. I want to see whether entrainment gets me thinking about whether I see entrainment somewhere else and what it would do and what the implications would be and blah, blah, blah.
So let me push back on this a little. We know that this is my issue with generalizability and generalization, right? We know that nothing is somehow universally and cross-contextual generalizable, no assertion. But really our goal as researchers is to make generalizations. That's what theory is, right? Theory is a abstracted, it's a general statement of some sort, of some association, something that happens, right?
Yes.
Now, we're not claiming it's a universal law. It's probabilistic generalization. It's contextualized whatever it is we're doing, but it's always with the idea. So how do we make a statement that we find generalize? If every study is a case study, How do we make the finding from the case study theory? Well, by using existing theory, right? Because existing theory hopefully has accumulated multiple ideas in it. So that will tell, and if I'm doing something and I use logic, I use data, I use existing theory, and I make generalizations. I think, but it has to be a humble generalization. It should understand the contextual, right? It's not some universal law. It's a probabilistic contextualized statement about a general regularity that I suspect is out there, right? And if, and that's the way you look at it, but we're actually in the business of making generalizations. I think that's our job.
I agree with you. And, one of the articles that I'm reading says that if we were not doing this, how can we take money from policymakers or businesses? Because this is what they want to see. I guess my reservation is the strength of those claims, right? Yeah. And some researchers will challenge this idea of us offering plausible claims, that isn't strong enough, and that we want to have more data and do more case studies so that we can generalize further. And I think, why? What we're offering, as you said, is a humble knowledge claim. This is not the way the world works for sure, but this is in the realm of possibility. And what we are offering is maybe a novel insight for our consumers to maybe think about their worlds differently. And part of what I think we need to do as researchers is to educate our knowledge consumers that, what we're offering is not gospel truth. It needs to be accepted critically. It needs to be reevaluated within their context to understand why it may or may not work.
So we're on the same page there, Shaila. You and I, exactly what you just said, especially for any particular study. But I will say this. There are some areas where, especially if there's a cumulative tradition, like there are many people over the years who have been looking at it, where we actually have some confidence. Again, it's usually probabilistic. It's not universal deterministic laws that we're identifying, but we do find tendencies that seem to hold. If it's strategy, there are certain strategies that say innovation leaders might follow that low-cost leaders might not, and vice versa, right? So, and then we find time and time again that this seems, fast followers versus early movers, right? We've now seen that in industry after industry after industry, and we can make arguments about first mover and fast. So there are things where we can, when we teach, for example, teach agile methods. It's like this works because we have a whole bunch of studies. There's there's a cumulative body of knowledge. So I think we can say certain things confidently, as long as we say, but you need to execute, and each company's different and all of that. But we can do that over time. When we have an edifice, we can make prescriptive statements. I don't have a problem with that. I think the problem is when you do one study and you make a prescriptive statement, right? Or you don't understand all the boundary conditions of your prescriptive statements, and then you're running around acting as if this is immutable, and you don't understand the decontextualize them, right? I think again, humility in making those statements, but then still make them, right? I think we're in the business of making generalizable or generalizations, right? That's our job. And some of them we can be more confident in than others. We should never be universally confident that we have some sort of immutable deterministic law, but we don't have to be so damn humble that anything we're saying is just an idea and you could take it or leave it. No, because then we didn't do our job. We didn't understand existing theory in our domain. We can move it up a little bit from there.
Well, there's also another implication of that. I mean, if you go by that, then really the onus is to be much more programmatic, to follow up any one study on entrainment in open source with at least 10, 20, 30 other papers on the same thing, right? So we'd have to be much more programmatic and not jump from one topic to the next, from paper to paper, which is what most of us, including us here, which is usually what we do because we're incentivized to do that. Yeah. So how much time does any of us really spend in programmatic research building
I
this
don't know, they're out
cumulative
there.
knowledge.
I'm working with Matt Germanprey. He's been doing open source for 2 decades, and Aaron Lindbergh and I now have 3 papers on open source coordination, and we're going to do more.
But are you
I
truly
think all your
replicating
research doesn't have to be programmatic, but you can have some. You should have some.
So I understand that we need replication, and this is me being somewhat contrary. So 2 arguments against replicate the active pursuit of replication rather than novelty. The one is, it's, as Jan pointed out, it's harder to get a replication study published in premier journals.
Absolutely.
Yep, right. So the incentive structure is not in place for this kind of programmatic research that you are advocating for.
Yeah.
But my second challenge is more fundamental. Should we be pursuing that? Because the nature of our the space within which we work is so intransigent. I mean, it is constantly moving, right? So we think we understand something about a phenomenon, and the phenomenon shifts. And if we are trying to replicate past work based on where the phenomenon is right now, we shouldn't be able to replicate. So yeah. I wonder if, the premier that we're placing on the premium that we're placing on novelty isn't warranted by what we study.
Well, all right. So I think that it's a rhetorical move, right? For example, the phenomenon changed. We have a fairly robust finding from some previous version of the phenomenon. So you have to set it up ahead that changed. Therefore, we'd expect it to be different. You do the analysis, but it's the same. That might work, right? So you always have to argue for why what you're doing matters. And if you're not compelling, then yeah, you don't make it at a top tier journal. But I agree with you. And I think we're on and Shaila, we've talked so many times that now we're on the same page. But I will tell you this. I heard you say Recker's name, but you called him Jan. But before you called him Jan, you paused. In your head, you were going to call him Recker, weren't you? And then you switched it to Jan because you wanted to somehow not just call him Recker.
Because he's a nice and gentle person.
Is this true? Am I diagnosing the situation correctly?
Yes.
I've got Shaila thinking of you in her head as Recker. The whole world thinks of you as Recker anymore. You're just another Jan, and then they have to think to
or
get
hair
to
professor doctor.
Yeah, professor doctor.
Exactly. Yeah.
Guys, this has been amazing. I don't think we reached a conclusion yet in any way. But I'm quite mindful that people don't listen for more than 45 minutes, Shaila. It's really important that we come to a stop.
We're over 45
minutes is a lot. I was thinking maybe not past 5 minutes anymore with this generation.
No, yeah. So it's been wonderful to have you on. I mean, we haven't even talked about the many of your accomplishments. So I personally think I've worked with you as an editor, and I learned so much from that, from working as an A with you. We haven't even touched upon that. But I will say this: I'd hope that in your genre that you two and others are creating, again, I draw the analogy to design science, and the one thing that they failed to generate in the years that followed are these really strong exemplar papers. And I just hope that we now get to see some really cool, innovative, interesting, timely pattern type of papers. I really hope so, right? Because I do think that makes a huge difference if you just see 1 or 2 or 3 shiny examples. Also because I don't know whether it's the same for everyone, but I like modeling on a nice, cool, interesting paper, right? Yeah. So I do hope that now that we see this is a legitimate and here's a lot of guidance on how to do this, now let's do it. Let's get busy doing this, and instead of thinking more about how do we deal with the issue of generalizability, we can worry about that. And sure. But I think first I want to see some things, irrespective of how
and they're out there. So I'll send you this book chapter that Shaila and I are working on, and we point out since in the last 4 years, there's a dozen.
Well, send me a few, and we put them in the show notes, and draw some attention to them. Let's popularize.
By the way, I do want to make a point. because it's kind of interesting because we just talked in this how Shaila, she came out with a paper in 2022 where I was associate editor. She and I came out with an editorial in 2022 where we're co-authors. So someone might look at that and think, what is going on here? Do these editors all just work together? And then, so I do want to point out that Shaila submitted that paper probably in 2016 or 2017 or 2018 or something. I was an associate editor working with Andrew. We had accepted that paper. And then after the paper was accepted, probably, and then it took a while for it to get published, then Andrew said, hey, I have this editorial idea. Shaila, you were the author of this great paper. Nick, you were the editor of this great paper. So then we wrote together for the first time ever after everything. So there was no conflict of interest. I just want to point that out because on the outside, it might look like this is all, because you have a paper in 2022 where I'm the associate editor. And then you have another editorial in 2022 where I'm your co-author.
That is a really good point. Yeah.
So
I think it's a good point. I mean, like, it saddens me that we actually draw attention to these things. But I think it's a good thing that you pointed out because, yes, there are some ethical rules, and yes, they are being followed. No, this is not a boys' club. This is not a whatever. Yeah. Especially, these journal, like, Andrew has been incredibly careful with these sorts of things. And so, no, there's no free lunches for anyone, right? So,
speaking of which, I'm going to go have lunch now.
I'm kind of hungry too.
The other was wonderful.
I'm really tickled pink to be on this. Thank you.
All right. Well, it was good talking to you. See you next time.